image-changing work with Richard Nixon was done between November of '67 and the Miami Convention. During then, they completely eliminated the tricky dick, the loser image. All these bad things that had been hangovers of 1962 would form the basis of that the television campaign of '68. And Nixon didn't just use television, but he used very deliberately controlled television, which means that every cameraman, every producer, every director was hired by his staff, and the whole purpose of the program was to flatter him, to bring out personality qualities which his staff believed the voters would respond to.
As of March 1st, the Congress has not invited the President to deliver the State of the Union address, meaning he has so far gone the longest of any president in his first year without confirming a date for the State of the Union, with the exception of President Nixon in 1969.
Well, a little bit of history, I like it.
When the public outcry and Mr. Humphrey's outcry about Nixon not appearing on these shows reached such a crescendo that they finally and reluctantly decided that he could be hurt less even by a bad appearance on a show like this than he was being hurt by a continued refusal to appear. The only area in which dishonesty creeps in is if the reporter is to pretend to be completely objective. For example, if the New York Times covers the Columbia riots and pretends to be writing a totally objective news story about that, I think that's dishonest, because obviously the editorial board and the reporters assigned have personal feelings, which they attempt to disguise as only fair to the reader, to let him know from what source are his interpretations and are these observations coming. There has to be some option open to a voter to say no, to say that this system did not provide me with a sufficient choice. It's not Richard Nixon. It's the influence of electronic media on the political process. And I said, well, that's just a disgrace. Those people just don't know what they're doing. And he said, you're wrong. He said, to you and I it's a disgrace, but to all those housewives out there in Minnesota and Wisconsin, they're going to say, what a dear, kind man. And they're going to say, what a warm human being. And it will turn out, Roger said, to be one of the most effective single pieces of political advertising the whole campaign.
The situation is that Czechoslovakia is invaded by the Soviet Union. Shakespeare is there with Leonard Gormont, and he says, they're out to get us, Len. They always have been and they always will be. They're ruthless bastards, and they're trying to conquer the world. We have to stand up to them at every turn. You present this, and it's very obvious to even a casual reader that this is the epitome of childishness.
What I am suggesting is that during the process of a political campaign, the men who are hard at work manipulating the minds of the voters and viewers, the first instinct is to react to a thing with total pragmatism. Mm-hmm. And whatever deep sorrow Mr. Shakespeare might have felt at the plight of the Czechoslovakian people was sublimated to his first response, which was, this helps us, because all those people who said Nixon is too tough on Russia no longer have as much to say. We must be very clear on this point. It's not what's there that counts, it's what's projected, that the response is to the image, not to the man.
Let's take something like the minority question. Everybody's terribly sensitive about minorities. I mean, everybody. You got to have Negroes, you got to have Jewish people, you got to have Catholic people, Irish people, the whole business here.
The Price observation that the American voter, and this is again Price's phrase, is basically lazy and basically uninterested in making an effort to understand what we're talking about. That if he is to be moved, it is his emotions which have to be roused, not his intellect, because his intellect is so stultified and dormant and sound asleep because of onslaughts of Beverly Hillbillies and Mayberry RFD that it's very hard for a politician to break through that way. So let's rouse him emotionally by the projection of an image with which he can identify. And that in the television age, when most of our exposure to political candidates comes through television, the voter makes an identification between the political candidate on television and all the other television celebrities to which he is exposed, to whom he is exposed. So that, as Price said, personality is the most important factor. That the American voter wants his president to be a combination of God, Father, hero, Pope, King, leading man, all these things, which no single human being can be. And the voter creates the illusion in his mind that this is what the president should be. So men are drawn into the political process to fulfill that illusion. Mm-hmm. And they do it far more successfully through sophisticated uses of television technique, because television is such a powerful medium of expression, than they could ever do it before. And that the line, therefore, between politics and show business is becoming it's indistinct already, I think, and it's becoming almost non-existent. It all depends what kind of television you're talking about. This kind of television, where I come on your show and where you are certainly not employed by Simon & Schuster to make me look good for an hour, where I'm not paying your salary, this kind of television might expose, at least it has the chance to. But the kind of television which made up 90% of Mr. Nixon's campaign, and which Price, again, was so careful to stress, had to be controlled television, where the entire situation was staged by Nixon staff members to highlight personality qualities of Mr. Nixon, which they wanted to project. The single exception, in 10 programs, an average of 7 panelists on each program, 70 people, one man snuck in, or was allowed in, who had the professional ability in questioning to actually contend with Mr. Nixon and his responses. And the reaction of the Nixon staff after that program was, my God, this was awful. We must make sure this never happens again. Now, I don't think that they were seeking exposure, because if they were seeking a real communication, they would have welcomed that kind of a thing. Ailes believed, and I believed, and I said so in the book, that Mr. Nixon came off the better. But the men above Ailes, the men who were so worried about exercising direct control and not exposing Mr. Nixon to any kind of pressure or any kind of prodding, penetration from the outside, said this was just awful, and this kind of thing could not be allowed to happen again. Their problem was that if you're going to direct and to conduct such a controlled campaign, that there is bound to be some kind of reaction from elements who are opposed to you, saying Mr. Nixon is afraid to face the people. Now, they could answer this argument, and they could also project even more powerfully their conceived image of Mr. Nixon by putting him in front of 7 people who had been very carefully selected. And the selection process went on for 3 days before each of these shows. And we talked about the minority representation which existed, but the one thing that all these people had in common, with a single exception of Mr. McKinney in Philadelphia, was that none of them was trained to ask a question in a professional, direct manner, and that there was no opportunity for follow-up, because there was a studio audience, much bigger than there is here. There were 350 people brought into the studio. They were all Republicans. They were all Nixon partisans, and their role, according to Roger Ailes, was simply to serve as an applause machine. And they were briefed on this. They were warmed up ahead of time by a television producer who said, after each of Mr. Nixon's answers, applaud. And in a couple of cases, actually, applause signs flashed in the studio. So the housewife who was brought in to represent the suburban housewife contingent of the voting populace would say, well, Mr. Nixon, just what can we do about Vietnam? A very loosely, generally worded question, which Mr. Nixon would respond to in precisely the same manner that he had been responding to that question since before New Hampshire. It perhaps would have benefited from a little more direct discussion, so that when Mr. Nixon gave his answer, which they had someone in the control booth with a stopwatch actually timing his answers to try to get them down shorter and shorter in time, because this was better show business. When he gave the answer, the applause would start. And by the time the applause was finished, he would then turn to the Jewish attorney who sat next to the suburban housewife, and the Jewish attorney would ask a question about the Middle East. So that there was no opportunity, for follow-up or for real discussion. But the premise, the advertised premise of the shows, was Mr. Nixon discusses the problems of America directly on live television with the American people. And I would submit that it was a false premise.
I don't know that the free enterprise system, which is called democracy, in this case, is going to admit of anything less than an attempt to maximize your votes by whatever means.
This is the only country in the world, however, which permits political candidates to actually buy airtime. No one else does it. We do it because we're so advertising oriented, and if we can advertise toothpaste, why not presidential candidates? And I think that what Kennedy did is just as false and just as invalid as what Nixon did. And again, Nixon is not the first and won't be the last. He may have been the most successful, but it certainly wasn't the only candidate to use this kind of approach. And my complaint is not with his particular use of the approach, but my qualm is with the whole approach itself, and the fact that it seems to be growing, that we have less and less direct communication with our candidate, that all we ever get to see now is the televised image, the finished product of all these mechanics, so that on election day, Are we really voting for or against a particular candidate? I think almost all campaigns today, when there is money and talent available, are constructed the same way. And I think more campaigns in the future will be. It's an approach that the people are not really prepared to contend with, because it's our fault more than their fault. I mean, we used to believe everything we read, and we learned the hard way that this was a bad thing to do. But I think we still believe everything we see on television. We haven't yet learned to look at television with the same critical eye with which we now look, and with which you are now looking at what has been written. We still tend, I think, to accept at face value, literally, almost everything we see on television. And if this face value is a different value from what lies behind it, I think we are permitting ourselves to be deceived, and it's not so serious when it's being deceived about a deodorant or a tube of toothpaste. But when it's about a man who wants to lead us either on a senatorial or as a governor or as a president, then I think we're moving into an area which should be looked at pretty seriously. The Nixon advertising people not only had contempt for the forgotten American, but they also seemed to have a certain contempt for Mr. Nixon himself. Because if they really believed all the things that they claimed to believe about him and his abilities, I wonder why they were so reluctant to allow him to face any kind of outside pressure. If they were so convinced that this was, the great man, the best man, then why not let him express and expose himself? That you could be so embarrassed about your man's inability to communicate. And actually, I think, isn't communication really an important element of this whole leadership process? I mean, what good is it to have a man with total brilliance and great mental acumen who is totally unable to communicate his ideas, his philosophies, and his leadership to the people? I think that the communication element is a very real and a significant part of leadership today.
In a recent report from the President's Commission on Violence, it's been suggested, it was, the board was started because of Bobby Kennedy's assassination, that perhaps because of the risk involved in having a presidential candidate campaign in public, that maybe all, campaigning will have to be done on the television. Now, from what you've said about your view of this sort of thing, do you think that there's any way that a non-linear candidate such as Nixon could fare as well as, say, Bobby Kennedy obviously would have done through the use of television? Or do you think it's possible for people to develop that critical eye that you were talking about?
I don't know. I haven't seen too many signs in the years since the election of a critical eye being developed. But if the campaign has to be conducted on television, and it's kind of a sad thing that it does, although it may not make the campaign any more or any less communicative. And I don't think that much real communication takes place in a stump speech, or in an auditorium. When they give the standard speech to 500 partisans and they all applaud. I don't know what kind of communication that is. But if the communication on television is a free and open kind of thing, I think it can be valuable. I mean, I think it would be wonderful to take the two candidates and just put them on two chairs like this and not have any moderator, any panel, any questioners, and just let them talk to each other for 3 hours and just let them explore each other and let this whole process be televised. That kind of free and open and objective and X-ray type television, I think, could be very valuable, much more valuable than the in-person whistle-stop campaigning. But if all the time on which a candidate appears on television has been bought, paid for, and by his own staff, and if every camera trained on him is actually in his employ, I think we're just going to have increasingly contrived images projected.
Well, would you consider, though, like NBC or CBS or ABC impartial? I mean, could they be considered impartial?
I think that's a crucial question, though. I mean, you point in the book to the Nixon people's hostility toward the media, and they really believe that the networks are trying to do them in. And it seems to me that that's the explanation for their eagerness to buy and package their own television time. Now, what's a candidate like Nixon going to do if NBC is out to get him?
Well, do you really think they are?
I do, sure. I watched the returns come in, and you could see the pain on their faces, I think, as Nixon rolled into an early lead.
Well, I didn't notice that, but maybe, I might have just been tired. I'm not denying that this kind of hostility could exist. I think what he can do, what a candidate should do, is have some sort of a combination. Have an NBC or have a network exposure and have his own exposure through his own people if he has to buy time. And at least the viewer at home then could compare the two images and, you know, to notice, are they very different? Are they very much the same? The one unpaid interview that Mr. Nixon conducted during the campaign until those two quiz shows toward the end was a segment of 60 minutes in which Mike Wallace sat like this in a chair and talked to him for about 15 minutes. And this was projected to the country as a part of the journalistic 60-minute, totally objective thing. But it so happens that Mike Wallace, you know, is a very strong Nixon partisan. You know, he likes Nixon very much. And he was obviously liking the man that much, not going to go after him, even though he's a very, I think, you know, I'm not saying that he fudged the thing, because I think he's a very professional guy. Consider the possibility that Mr. Wallace's bias in favor of Mr. Nixon might infuse this supposedly objective interview with...
I'll accept that. That's why it seems to me that the most reasonable way to run a campaign is to let each candidate do his own material.
But if that's all he does, you know, what basis do we have for making a judgment on who he is? But this debate format I don't think is very effective. It's like a ping pong game where, you know, they're asked a question, they have 40 seconds to reply. You know, that's foolish. Just talk to each other for a long time. You know, that would really be revealing.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but good night and thank you all very much. Thank you.